Walden sounded amazing. I read the description for this when I discovered it randomly on Letterboxd and thought I absolutely need to see this. Having now watched it, I can confirm I'm a little disappointed. There's nothing necessarily bad about it as such. It makes sense. The performances are very good, and I'll talk about that in a moment, particularly with Walden. But I just didn't find it very engaging. I just didn't find it to be that fascinating. Maybe my hopes were too high because it did sound like my kind of film. But unfortunately, I just found it to be a little mundane. This was released in 2023. It's written and directed by Mick Davis, and it stars Emile Hirsch as Walden. And Walden is a stenographer, and he finds out that he is dying. So he decides, and this is the bit that made me quite excited. Well, the stenographer aspect made me quite excited, first of all, because I thought maybe we'd get some exciting courtroom scenes. Not so much. And the other bit that made me excited was the concept. Because he is obviously finding out that he is dying, he obviously doesn't really see the risk of, for example, being locked up for a long period of time or anything. He decides to seek revenge on the criminals who escaped prosecution. So obviously as a stenographer, he is in the courtroom seeing these people getting let off for getting really light sentences when actually the crimes were quite severe. So he is trying to right those wrongs with his remaining time on Earth by going after them. And as a concept, I thought that sounded really, really exciting. I thought it sounded really different. I don't know if I've ever seen a film with a protagonist who's a stenographer. I might have done, but I can't think of any. If you know of any, please feel free to share. And I will say Walden as a character I did like. He's definitely a very well-written character, and the performance there is really brilliant. The performance is really engaging. I will admit that when he was on screen, I obviously didn't want to look away from the character. I was really keen to see what his next move would be. But in terms of the specifics of the narrative, I just found it to be a little bit dull. And there were moments, don't get me wrong, there were definitely moments that were quite interesting. But I just feel like it wasn't as fascinating as it could have been. So I didn't hate it, but I think maybe my own hopes were too high because it sounded like exactly my kind of film. I read the description, immediately bumped it up to the top of my to-watch list, and was rather looking forward to it. And I just found it to be a pretty okay experience. Now, an okay film is not a bad thing. An okay film is still not a bad film. But I was expecting so much more, and I think it had a lot more potential. I think also, and this is not a criticism, just a thought that I had, is that they could have really gone down the comedy route with this. And I'm not saying they should have done. I just think that would have been an interesting angle because there is a lot of scope here for dark humour. And I think they could have done something interesting with that. But again, that's not the film's fault. That's not the place they wanted to go. That's not the decision they made. That's absolutely fine. With regards to it being dark and thrilling, yeah, there are some moments. But in general, it just wasn't as exciting as I wanted. It wasn't quite the experience I'd hoped for. But that being said, it's an okay film. Walden is definitely not a bad film. Emile Hirsch gave a really great performance. And there are some good moments. From start to finish, it's not perfect. It didn't quite meet my expectations, but nevertheless, Walden is still interesting as a film and as a character. And if you're curious, if it sounds like it might appeal to you, then I'd say it's probably worth checking out still.